Hello, and welcome to the Exhibitionistas podcast. This is a podcast where we examine artists through their solo exhibitions. My name is Emily Harding. I'm an art lover and someone who enjoys seeing and talking about art. And Joanna Pierre Neves, my co-host, is an art curator and a critic. This episode will discuss Philip Guston. This is an exhibition that took place at the Tate Modern, and it's an exhibition with a bit of controversy around it. It was supposed to come out in 2020, but was postponed for 4 years, and then it was brought back forward, and there's been a lot of back and forth and ink spilled, quite frankly, about the hows and whys of that postponement. So we'll dip into that quite a bit, and you'll see that I am not the expert of the duo, as I talk about Philip Guston as being an impressionist rather than an expressionist at various times, but you'll forgive me for that. And Joanna kindly corrects me, so that's all okay. Joanna brings up Alice Neel and the banality of evil, which comes through this episode. And Barbie makes an appearance, which is great. Yeah, I really hope that you enjoy it, and let us know what you think. Hello, and welcome to the Exhibitionistas podcast. We visit exhibitions so that you have to, so that you can't resist but to go and see an exhibition. We explore the work of an artist through their solo shows. I'm Emily Harding. I'm an art lover and an exhibition goer.
And I am Joanna Pierre Neves, a contemporary art curator and writer. So we decided to do this podcast because, as someone who works in contemporary art, I find that we lack certain platforms of discussion. So I listen to a lot of podcasts about contemporary fiction, stand-up comedy, even film and politics, but very few about art, which aren't jargony or too superficial or too celebrity oriented. So that's why I am exhibitionista number 2, and very happy to be here with you.
Hardly a number 2. Yeah. So, I mean, and I just want to say too that it's like, I think with this podcast too, is someone who is not a professional, a professional art curator or professionally in the art world, but just someone who really enjoys it a lot. I think it's just nice to have a place that's a little like lighter on pretense, perhaps, that might crop up occasionally in the art world, someplace that's just really joyful and fun to meet and talk about art. So, yeah.
So, Emily, without further ado, do you want to introduce the artist that we're
Yeah.
talking about today?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So today we're going to talk about Philip Guston. He has a retrospective at the Tate Modern, which is open from it opened on the 5th of October. It runs until the 25th of February. So if you're in London, there's still lots of time, hopefully, by the time this airs, to go and see the exhibition.
Can I just add something, Emily? Can I
Yeah.
just say that this is hopefully it will reach, other people. We are based in London. So obviously we talk mostly about exhibitions in London, but you don't have to go to the exhibitions if you don't live in London or if you don't have time, because this is really a pretext to talk about compelling art and artists and their body of work. So obviously if you can go to the exhibition, please do. That's why we do this, because going to exhibitions is such an experience that you have to talk about afterwards.
Mm.
So yeah, Emily, back to you.
Yeah, no, very good point. Yeah, it's certainly not a requirement or a prerequisite to see this exhibition before. So Philip Guston lived, to my mind, what I would think of the classic artist existence. I mean, he smoked, he drank, he was mostly self-taught, he was prolific, he was a bit of an outsider. He produced work that was loved and that was absolutely hated. He was one of these guys that sequestered himself with his art for long periods of time and couldn't be interrupted. But he was also absolutely essential to the super vibrant scene at the Cedar Bar with the likes of Pollock and de Kooning and Rothko that all made up the New York school.
By the way, Jackson Pollock, who he went to high school with.
Yeah.
Which, sometimes in life, you
I
just have
know.
to be
It
at
was
a
meant to
certain place at a
be.
certain time.
Exactly, it
Yeah.
was meant to be. So I did a bunch of reading on him, which was a real pleasure, but the main sources that I drew from were, Night Studio, a memoir of Philip Guston by his daughter, Musa Mayer. It's, Hauser& and Wirth Publishers. This was so brilliant, I loved it, like, even if you don't necessarily want to read more about Philip Guston, it's a brilliant memoir, like the relationship between father and daughter, and kind of a peek into the life of someone who was certainly a genius.
I saw a few videos. I went on YouTube and I read Ross Felden's book about Guston, and Musa Maya. I became much more interested in her than in Philip Guston
Yeah,
because cute as a button, that
as
woman.
a
She's
button.
so cute. She's just the cutest person on earth with, like, cute intelligence. And she's, because you say he's the typical artist, but for me as a professional, he's the cliche male
Yeah,
artist
for
who
sure.
really did not play a big role in his family and let Musa, i.e. the muse, do the difficult work in the family. I don't know, you read the biography, I didn't. And Musa was a writer, so his wife, and then the daughter started writing. So yes,
Yeah.
please read the book because she's an excellent thinker and writer about a daughter coming to terms with that kind of figure from that time.
Yeah, living in the shadow of that kind of greatness. And you're right, like he was not happy when she was born. He thought it was really going to be a drag on his artistic output and concentration. I mean, he loved her wildly, which was, clear in
Mm.
other ways, but he was not sort of the attentive doting father who was full of, unconditional acceptance that we all wish we would have had. But yeah, a really beautiful book, and she was so insightful in her writing. It was a really moving piece of work on its own. And then Dor Ashton wrote a critical study of Philip Guston that was published by the University of California Press. And then there's a great short documentary that you can get on Amazon called Philip Guston: A Life Lived. It's 1 hour. It's right at the end of Guston's life. It was actually published, or released rather, just after his death, and that was done by Michael Blackwood. So great resources out there. But so I'm going to start with a quick potted history of Guston. So his parents emigrated to Montreal from Odessa to flee the pogroms that killed and targeted Jewish people. He was born in 1913 in Montreal as Philip Goldstein. He changed his name later on. He was the youngest of 7 kids. They moved to LA when he was 6. When he was 10, he found the body of his father, who had committed suicide. And he also lost an older brother to an accident in his teens. So, some pretty primary tragedies and traumas there that he said, certainly influenced him and his work throughout his life. His mother supported his art by sending him to a comic correspondence school, and she enrolled him in the Manual Arts High School later on, which is where he met Pollock. He didn't complete either. His mother was so supportive of him and his talent that she would lie to visitors when they came round that he wasn't home, when really he was locked up in his closet with one bare light bulb, which is an image that comes through a lot of his work, just working on his drawing. And that was something that was, sort of endorsed by the rest of the family, to just let Philip do his thing.
He went to comic correspondence school. I think he went to the Cleveland cartoon school of Cleveland, something like that. He was relearning how to, which I think is important because at the end of his
Yeah.
life, he does go back to that particular kind of drawing and imagery.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And I think it might, yeah, you're right. It might have been the Cleveland school, but it was, I mean, he did, it's like, I think it's the kind of thing where it's like, here, draw a bunny and then send it back, was the image
Hmm.
that I got of it. And
Oh,
he
because I
only
tried
did,
to research it very quickly and I didn't find anything because now it's the Cleveland Institute of Art. I don't know if it's the same thing, but
I'm not
if you
sure.
look into it, there's lots of people who either taught there or like cartoonists or comics authors that are related to that online. So I think that's an important reference because later on it will make sense to our listeners.
Absolutely, absolutely. He went to the Otis Art Institute, and again didn't finish, but that's where he met his wife, who was also a painter at the time, and later a poet, Musa McKim. Throughout his life, he was a mural painter, he was an abstract impressionist, he was a figure maker. He just, like, the breadth of his work is pretty phenomenal, and we'll talk about that in the exhibition. It looks like seeing the exhibition of at least four different artists. And then he died of a heart attack in Woodstock in New York in 1980.
I love that you say that he's an abstract impressionist because he was actually he's the art historian comes in with the with the heaviness, but he was an abstract expressionist. But
Oh,
because his
okay.
work was so
Oh, sure.
atmospheric, some people deemed his work to be more of an abstract form of impressionism than expressionism. So that's it was kind of a play. I don't remember which was the art critic who said that, but it was kind of a play with words. And he was
Right.
sometimes called the Monet of abstract expressionists, if I'm not mistaken.
Got it. Got it. Okay, so do you want to tell us a little bit about this exhibition? Maybe just start with, there was a bit of controversy around this exhibition. Do you want to tell us a little bit about
There
that?
was, yes, there was, Emily. There was a lot of controversy around it. So, this was a traveling exhibition that started at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, then went on to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and finally in the US would finish its travels at the National Gallery in DC. However, George Floyd's death propelled a 4-year postponement of the show that was to open in 2020. And you can ask, what's the connection between this horrendous thing that happened and Philip Guston's work? Well, this is because Guston, as we'll see, created in the last decade of his life paintings with figures wearing Ku Klux Klan hoods as a form of satire and philosophical quest about evil and exclusion.
It actually wasn't just at the
Yeah,
end of his life. He was painting
no,
KKK figures
mm,
in the 30s as well, at the very beginning of his career, in a
absolutely,
different way, a very different, he gave it a
absolutely.
very different treatment, but it's certainly something that ran right through the length of his body.
Yes, absolutely. And the exhibition, by the way, showcases that really beautifully. Like you really see how aware he was. You get a sense that he was aware of his past, of his Jewishness, and the
Yeah.
problems that entailed in Europe for his father as well, because his father couldn't live in Canada. He was depressed. They went to California and he became a scrapper in California. Like he would sell old junk and collect junk. And he ended up committing suicide, which obviously is
Hmm.
not uncommon for people, fleeing the Third Reich. He did inherit a consciousness.
Sorry, he wasn't fleeing the
The
Third
pogroms,
Reich.
the
Yeah,
pogroms.
he was
Yeah, the
fleeing the
pogroms.
Russians. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Emily.
Yeah.
And yeah, so you can see that he inherited a lot of transgenerational trauma, but also a consciousness of terrible things happening to communities, to different communities of people who suffered exclusion, to say the least. So, of course, when the exhibition was postponed, people thought this was a condescending attitude. And so there was a letter of protest against the postponement of the exhibition, signed by many Black artists, such as Pope L, who passed away recently and who has an exhibition at South London Gallery at the moment. Julie Meritu, Adrian Piper, Lorna Simpson, these major artists came in defense of Philip Guston's exhibition. And so the postponement was unpostponed, so it was shortened, and the exhibition finally traveled until it came to us at the end of last year. Which is, I think, as well ironic, because Philip Guston was not Philip Guston, as you said very rightly. He was Philip Goldstein. Also, the KKK was not and still isn't very nice and inclusive to Jewish people.
Yeah, no, they targeted, yeah. Yeah, the
Absolutely
KKK
targeted.
absolutely I read this book earlier in the year about the KKK and kind of how it was popularized, and it was looked at through this guy who kind of really, garnered support for it in the Midwest. Apparently, I think it was Indiana was sort of the capital, like, had the biggest KKK membership, as it were,
Wow.
than any state,
Mm,
which is kind of unusual. I mean, I'm from the Midwest, I had no idea.
mm.
So it was really fascinating to look at the rise, but I mean, the targeting of Jewish people was intense as well, but the Jewish population is a lot smaller than Black population in America. And,
Yeah.
it's yeah, didn't get, but I mean, Guston was seeing this in the 30s in California, I mean, he was seeing the
Mm.
KKK alive and well, and it certainly made a deep impact on him and his work.
So, how was this exhibition organized? It is somewhat of a chronologic exhibition, but it strikingly starts with one of Guston's last paintings called The Legend or Legend. It sets the tone, right? So, Guston's work and painting is much about his worries and values as it is about his failures and breakdowns. And in this painting, he's in bed surrounded by objects which remind us of his childhood, his dad's occupation as a scrapper, and his obsessions such as food, reading, small humble objects. And adjacent to this room is another one with Guston's paintings, incredibly made when he was 17,
Yeah,
and they are quite technically impressive, also very, picking up here and there references to surrealism. He loves the Kiriko, for example, but it's not, he's not grown into his own artistry, for sure. And then the whole exhibition is separated in two, which is kind of a weird thing, because the second bit of the exhibition is about the last 10 years of his life. And the first bit of the first half of the exhibition is the whole path that leads in some ways to these last 10 years. Because
mhm.
let's say it, and I want to know what you think of it, but for sure, Guston was someone who loved painting and hated art. I think it's fair to say that
Yeah,
he was not comfortable with the whole structure around art, the system, the people, the way art was talked about, and the dogmatic. There was some dogmatism around
sure.
abstract expressionism, and he was never comfortable with that because he was also very politically aware. So he was very critical of
Yeah.
himself and also of art and its function in society.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that goes to his outsider thing. I mean, he resisted that formal kind of training that would give you that kind of dogma of, this is what artist is, this is what art is, this is what artists do. Even when he had success and was living in, for a time he was living part-time in New York City, part-time in Woodstock. And in New York City, he talks about how he really disliked having to go to all of these galleries all the time and see all the people and have all the conversations. And when he finally retreated to Woodstock, he could just do what he wanted to do, which was be in his studio and make his art. And so, I mean, he just didn't play the game in the same way that a lot of artists, do and sometimes need to do to kind of get it together. He really doubled down on his own instincts and his own relationship, I think, with the art he wanted to make.
It's very strange, isn't it? Because I think there's a whole myth around him. Just to explain to our listeners, he was a muralist for a while. He went to Mexico, painted a very important mural that still exists today, and it was again very political. It depicted war. It referenced, because of course by then, he was aware of the Second World War, and he was again felt that war particularly targeted his community and his family's community. You say he's an outsider, but I think I need to break that a little bit,
Mm,
because he did, hang out with the Kooning. He hung out with lots of
mhm.
important people, that whole intelligentsia, who were a group of men who basically, he was included in that big exhibition called 11 American Painters. I mean, there was only 11. He was there. So he was pretty much a part of that group. And he moved completely to abstraction. And what's really interesting is that his abstraction, I don't know how you felt about it. It wasn't overly represented in the exhibition and it felt reluctant. For me, it was something trying to emerge from the center of the painting. So everything's concentrated at the center. You can see his famous signature pink and red. So
Mm-hmm.
apparently that pink comes from cadmium red medium and titanium white. And you could see the whites, you can see the pinks, you can see the reds, you can see lots of colors that come back later,
Mm-hmm.
lavender, all those beautiful colors. He's such a colorist. I mean,
Mm.
for sure, it feels like he was working on his color spectrum. And I understand why he was called an abstract impressionist, because there's something that is not quite there. I mean, very specifically, the Greenbergian. So Clement Greenberg was this very important art critic who kind of like established what painting was. Not only was it the most important form of art, so drawing had no place there. And we know that Guston started with drawing quite a lot. I work with drawing, as you know. So for me, that's really important. And I saw someone who was a drafts person wanting to emerge, but couldn't because there was no platform for that at the time. And so the painting was an autonomous space, and you painted painting.
Sure,
The painting
sure.
was about itself. It was an absolutely free, autonomous space. And in some ways, and that was rather exciting, but also a very reductive definition of abstraction, but exciting to think you're building a fifth dimension. So you're building
Mm.
something. There's a very famous cartoon, actually, of Ard Reinhardt, an amazing abstract painter, where he did a lot of cartoons about abstraction and modern art. And you can see a visitor looking at an abstract painting. I hope I remember this correctly, saying, "What is this? And what is this doing? It's not representing anything." And then the painting comes out to him, if I remember correctly, and says, "And what are you doing? And what are you about?" And so for the first time, the spectator is looking at something in their own bodies, in their own space, looking at another space, and not using representation to stand in for something or to
Mm.
represent something, to represent something. It's not a window onto the world, it is
Yeah.
a space. So that was quite really exciting.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I've never really thought of it that way. I've never, yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I've never thought of the way that it was approached and what it was trying to do and how that was different. I've just always really enjoyed enjoyed the kind of enjoyed it, which I guess was the point, as you've
Yes.
described. It was for me to evoke whatever it was evoking for me, rather than here's an image and I'd like to tell this story that's very narrative. It's saying, go ahead. What does it feel like to be in front of this thing? In those later ones, especially, you could see him trying to make an image and then containing it,
Yeah.
I mean, there's kind of the late
Yes.
ones where it's like those heads, you can kind of see sort of the outline of human heads, or a couple that look sort of like buildings, cityscapes, I mean, so yeah, so you could see that there was part of him that was enjoying the exploration, but there was another part of him that was just as eager to get back to kind of what was inside him, which was image making.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the end of the first half of the exhibition, there's these beautiful drawing paintings, these linear shapes, because
Oh yeah,
the
yeah.
thing is that he was so masterful in what he ended up doing. Like his line is absolutely incredible. So tell us a little bit about that, because in the show it's kind of like you have little references of like huge breakdowns of Philip Guston, and then you're like, oh, okay, he had another breakdown, and then you hop off to the next room, and then the following room was like, oh, he moved away from home because he had another breakdown, and it never really is quite explored. What it is, that breakdown? Is it connected to his status or his the reception of his work? Is it, personal?
He was a very self-contained guy, very ambitious and very kind of driven by himself. I know I realize he's part of this New York scene, but there weren't that many people that just extracted themselves from New York and did something
Mm,
else. Well, I
mm,
mean, he was also a muralist when people were starting in New York. So he was in the Midwest and had a professorship in Iowa and then in Missouri. And so he was sort of away from the crowd for long periods. So kind of a bit of an outsider in that sense. So even though he had this sort of strong personal will and drive, he still really cared about what people thought about his work. He certainly had probably his biggest breakdown after the Marlborough show. I mean, he was a depressive guy. He talked about,
yeah, he
this.
suffered from depression, right? Yeah.
Absolutely,
Mm,
absolutely. So I think there was sometimes the kind of breaks were because of receptions to his work. Sometimes it was just he was a depressive guy. He drank a lot, he smoked a lot, he apparently was a great cook, but he wasn't feeding himself maybe the best, lots of,
he's a very
traditional
meaty guy, let's say.
male
Yeah.
diet, yeah, of the 1950s and 60s and 70s. He had insomnia. Moose's book is called Night Studio because he was often in his studio at
Oh,
night, working all
really?
night.
That
And
explains
then,
the last room and some paintings at the end that are so black.
yeah,
So like layers and layers of thick black paint. What paint? Black paint mixed with greens and such weird
yeah,
paintings.
yeah. So he would take things to put him to sleep and then things to wake him up. There's
Wow.
some
Mm,
of the drug taking going on, it seemed as well, which probably doesn't help a depressive state and a fragile mental health for anyone, quite frankly. But this is a good time to talk about that next period of paintings that he went into. So he went from very abstract work. One thing in the reading that really struck me was all of these artists were sort of part of this Sidney Janis gallery in New York. In 1962, when pop art hit the scene and Sidney Janis started carrying pop artists of the time. So Andy Warhol and Lichtenstein, is that right? Am I getting the name right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So the
Yes.
guys who did the Campbell soup and sort of the comic strip images, they all left. All the impressionists left that gallery in protest. They were like, "We are
Mm.
not that, and we don't want that association." So going to your point about like how that New York school was a very, very big thing in terms of setting the standard of what they thought was acceptable and what art is and what it isn't. And then he goes to making lines again and these small framed images that are, as you say, an arc of black across a canvas or something, which are miraculous. I have to say, it's incredible. And I think that is one of the things that is so incredible. The line is so alive. Like it looks like something that is living, which is something that he said he was always going for. He wants something that, when he's working in a studio and he goes away and he comes back, he wants to be surprised by like, oh wow, that happened.
Mm-hmm,
I did that
mm-hmm,
happen. That's incredible. And
mm,
you feel that in his work. So he went and he did those, incredible kind of basic images. And then he went to do the work that ended up going into the Marlborough show in 1970. And that was when he went back to his comic kind of underpinnings where he had all of these images of KKK people, hooded figures. He calls them the hood the I think he calls them the hoods, and they're driving in a car smoking a cigarette. There's a hooded figure that is a painter painting a self-portrait, so painting another hooded figure. They're drinking, they're hanging out, they're being casual. And I think so much of what he was doing there was looking at everyday evil.
and also the style of the paintings was so strange because it comes from that background of abstract expressionism, so very painterly,
Yeah,
very filled with that material, that paint material, very big, they're real painting. Well, not real, not that small paintings aren't real paintings, but you mean like they're painting,
Yeah.
they're
Yeah. The
big
grand sense.
sizes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So he takes on the same sizes almost of his previous paintings, but then he just paints these figures that are cartoonish and that are doing horrible things, things that Americans probably don't want to look at. And this comes back to the postponement, because I think in Europe it's a bit harder to understand what's going on in America. I was in DC for 3 months doing research at the Smithsonian, and white people are a minority, not a minority, but there's less white people than other ethnicities in DC, for example, which was I learned when I went there. And it's a whole different relationship to the violence of racism in America. It's much more discussed. To be very honest, I think it's in that ways is much more. It's taken up by institutions, and now it's spread to all the communities and ethnicities that weren't ever contemplated by. And even with Guston, they were subjects. They were not peers in some ways. Things have changed a lot in the United States. And when you go, especially in DC, we went to conferences, and the person doing the conference recognized that this was the land of whatever Native American community had lived there. So that's
Mm.
something that completely, blew my mind. We're not doing this in Europe at all. I hear a lot about like, oh, can we stop it with the apologies and
And DC is a city of extremes as well. I mean, it's,
for
historically
sure.
one of the more segregated cities. But interestingly, in one of the interviews with Musa Mayer, she was saying that she talked to the art director, whoever is the head of curation at the National Gallery in DC. And the person in that position said that when they came on board on the job, there were 47 curators, none of them were Black.
In
So
DC,
in
it's
DC,
incredible.
and all
Yeah.
of the staff who make the gallery run, most of them were non-white. So the initial letter for the postponement came from the National Gallery, and it came from this group of people that were white, essentially. I mean, maybe there were some non-white folks in there, but there weren't Black curators in that group of people. There's a lot of good things happening off of the back of tragic occurrences in the past few years. It's good to see that that is finally taking place. Certainly not as fast as we'd like, but this exhibition, I think, also brought up some of those really good questions. So Guston is working on this exhibition. He releases the exhibition at the Marlborough Gallery in 1970, and people hate it. Like, they hate it so
Hated it.
much. I mean,
Hated it.
back to, you think of 8 years previous, Guston was quitting the Sydney Janus Gallery because pop art had an exhibition there. And now he's doing something that, I mean, it's not pop art, but it's figurative and it's cheeky and it Renaissance influence in it, even with some of the
Hmm.
horizons and things like that. But it is cartoonish.
Yeah, you kind of wonder what was going on in his mind at the
Mm,
time. And you
mhm.
kind of wonder when this came about and when he started realizing that this is what he wanted to do. Parenthesis from the art historian: I have a real problem with the mystification of artists, especially male white artists, and the mystification of Philip Guston. Because the problem is that when you have this kind of context and this kind of controversy, then you kind of aggrandize the artist. And I felt a little bit a prisoner of that when I went into the exhibition, because I didn't love the exhibition as much as I thought I would.
Mm.
And I went in there like militantly, like, yes, let's go to the Guston. And I was with someone who was really not enthralled by it. Liechtenstein, Alice Neal, pop arts, Andy Warhol. He didn't single-handedly bring back, figuration to the art world. Let's just put it out there and stop with
Is
the
that a narrative?
mystifications.
Is
Yes,
that a narrative?
there's a
Okay, I didn't know
especially if
that.
you see the videos and you hear, there's a film called Questions to Philip Guston, something like that, with Roberta Smith, who's a very important art critic, telling him, and talking about him as if, he brought back, representation to the art world, and you kind of think, oh, come on. Yes, he did. I mean, he was very courageous, because I think from the perspective of masculinity, I think that's amazing what he did, and maybe it should be framed like that. I mean, he was in that very patriarchal group of artists. Amazing art. I love abstract
Sure.
expressionism.
Yeah.
A big part of it. The impact of those paintings is not to be frowned upon. It's beautiful. I love Klein, I love the Kooning, and then the Kooning was actually also painting figures, by the way. It was a huge influence, and because there were so many, the context in the United States at the time was of a country that had terrible painting until very recently. Then they welcomed Marcel Duchamp over there, who, by the way, was rejected in Paris, went to America, welcomed, like the star, the star artist of Europe, of what everything American art wanted to be. And there was this
Yeah.
effervescence at the time. There were lots of art critics, lots of art criticism in newspapers, lots of magazines, and people were listening to art critics. It was a very strange time. No one pays attention to them anymore. No one knows who they are anymore. But at the time, there were people who, were mentioned by musicians. He was very good friends with Morton Feldman, the musician, the minimalist musician. I mean, there were intersections between art languages. It was a big deal. There was a big power around these people, around these artists. And I think in terms of that context, wow, Philip Guston, wow, he was
Yeah.
alone afterwards.
Yeah.
Everyone ditched him, everyone.
Yeah.
And I think he said, there's a an interview with him where he says, I said to John Cage, you lock yourself in your studio, and then one friend stops coming, another friend stops coming, another friend stops coming, and then none of your friends come, and that's when it starts. And he was courageous like that. He was really, there was something about him that, his ghosts were more important than friends, or
Yeah.
the living people surrounding him. And
Yeah.
that is incredible. I think we need to reframe a little bit, the context of, he's not saving art or saving figurative art. He is actually extracting himself from a group and being unique and developing his own language that he probably should have developed way earlier, and making these incredible paintings that the Americans, I mean, that's a question for you, Emily, I think must have been very hard to look at the time, because
Mm.
the criticism was also like, why are we looking at this? It's fine. We've solved it. We
Yeah.
solved the KKK.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think, in 1970, it was still visible in the rearview mirror, I mean, the KKK and its legacy, and there's always that instinct to run away from things when it's still reasonably fresh. The US has never been great about having a discussion about race, and what it means, which is, I mean, we have it, it gets violent
Yeah.
at various points in history. The fact that, an artist is bringing this to this kind of forum and format, I can imagine the establishment was, really displeased. Really displeased. And I mean, I think it was misunderstood too that it was being casual about the KKK, when a different reading of it is that evil in the everyday, that it
Mm-hmm.
is in you, it is in me. I mean, racism is alive and well, whether you're putting up and burning a cross or you are driving around in your car smoking a cigarette. It's there, and it's a through line. And I think that's what he was trying to say with it. And I think it was just a difficult message at the time,
Why do you think people accuse him of being casual about the KKK?
because they look kind of cute, right? I mean, like, the images are
Yes,
they're kind of
cute as a
endearing.
button,
They're kind of
and they're
endearing. I mean,
pink.
they're
They're
pink.
pink. The
They're
cadmium red and the titanium white are pulling a lot of the work there, pulling a lot
exactly.
of the weight
They
of those
have
paintings.
those.
It's incredible.
He uses those long vertical lines for the eyes, and that long vertical line is kind of repeated in lots of different areas in the paintings. But yeah, they're kind of cute. They're kind of cuddly. They're kind of endearing. You kind of look at them and think like, oh, it's not a horrible, menacing image of something that is horrible and menacing. But again, I think that was the point of it, is that you could be looking evil in the eye and think, "Oh, nice," you know? I mean, which is absolutely
But
true.
that's what's so fantastic about it. It's because especially I think people mentioned the painting. I can't quite get the title. Maybe you remember that painting where you have, like you say, hooded figures in a car, just smoking cigarettes, driving casually, a bit disorganized, a bit chaotic out about in town, and then there's a corpse in the back. There's a
Yeah.
body, and then you think, is this casual or is this more violent? To speak of another amazing Jewish immigrant, Hannah Arendt, who said, like,
Mm.
talked about the banality of evil, and that's the
Yeah.
problem. It's when it's now people love to, the youngsters like to say normalize, it is normalized. And I
Yeah.
think that's the issue, isn't it? He's talking about normalization and the banality of evil in such a poignant way, with that pink that just numbs you because it's just so sickening and at the same time so attractive.
Mhm.
He really knows how to convey an atmosphere with color. It's just
Mhm.
so impactful.
It's
And
almost a
saying that
Barbie
it's
pink.
cute,
Yeah, it's almost a
it's
Barbie
almost
pink.
A Barbie pink, but a bit dirty, with some
Yeah.
lines of blue and gray. It's dirty Barbie pink. It's such it's it's such a powerful thing. He goes very far with that, doesn't he? When he says that he saw himself, he wanted to see himself as the hooded figure, and he
Yeah.
wanted to understand what it would be like to live as an evil creature. He wanted to perform that evil in some ways, and it's a very performative kind of image that he did there. Is so Also, he was fascinated by Crazy Cat. He loved Crazy Cat,
Yeah,
apparently, the
exactly.
very famous comics or cartoon.
I mean, kinda, is it famous? I don't know. I mean, if you I
Well,
wasn't
at the
aware of it.
time,
At the time, it
were
was
you
famous.
not?
When he was a kid, I
When he
had to
was a
look it
kid,
up.
yeah.
Yeah, I had to look it up.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, he struggled with his relationship to the turmoil in the world generally. I mean, wars, Vietnam, Korea, World War II, obviously, civil rights, and what was happening to the Black community in America. And he has this quote saying, it's a famous quote of his, "What kind of man am I? Sitting at home, reading magazines, going into a frustrated fury about everything, and then going into my studio to adjust a red to a blue." So, I mean, he clearly struggled with what is the role of the artist in society and in hopefully trying to right some of the wrongs that are happening in front of his eyes. And this is, I think, part of his response.
And what was the role of art? I think it's like, what can art do? I think it was his main worry. Like, I am
Yeah.
here. And especially when you said adjusting a red to a blue, obviously, he's also talking about, the movement he was part of before. But I think this is a question that we are asking ourselves now. It's such a timely exhibition
Mm.
because whether you in your job that we won't disclose here, or we will if you want, maybe have more of a feeling of kind of touching, politics and policy, and having an impact. But when you're in your studio as an artist, male artists nowadays are kind of thinking, is this my time? Should I be doing this? Should I be, white people, are thinking, should I be taking the platform, as
Mm.
it was
Mhm.
given to me? And how do I take a platform, understanding that it's given to me in a much more, in a freer and accessible way, more than to other people. We are asking ourselves a lot of questions, so I think it's a really timely exhibition. But it is also, to me, I felt it was so courageous and so impactful what he did. And that the other paintings, I could see that he also went back to his depression. So the paintings after that, so he quits Marlborough, Marlborough quit
Yep.
him. I don't quite know how that happened, but I can imagine that Marlborough was probably not very happy with the outcome of the exhibition.
Mm.
And he went into a very strange Keys, I think, gallery, there was in an area that was not an area of New York that was not fashionable. He decided, he worked with someone completely different. He kept going to away from New York, and he you can see that he's struggling with his
Really did.
personal
Yeah.
life. He painted his wife quite a lot, who, if anything, lived in his shadow. Apparently, she was a very quiet person. She
Hmm.
was a very intelligent person, but socially, she presented as someone who was kind of in the back, trying to
Absolutely.
keep things together, hold things together, like your typical
Yeah.
female male dynamic, let's
She took the
say.
mantle
And
she took the mantle on. If anybody has seen, Maestro recently, I mean, there's definitely a through line, the wife of, Leonard Bernstein and Musa. Philip Guston's wife was called Musa as well, so his daughter and his wife have the same name, confusingly. So his wife Musa definitely takes that kind of mantle on of being the supportive wife while being phenomenally talented herself. She painted a mural alongside his when they were doing the mural paintings for the Works Progress administration, and she was a poet as well, which she incorporates some of her poetry in his late work. But there's an anecdote where, if they had people over at their house in Woodstock, and, it would be after dinner and everybody would be in the living room kind of smoking and drinking and talking, and he would try to charm her out of the kitchen, and she would just say, "No, I've got the dishes to do, and I have so she would kind of be there in the background, but she was, I get the sense, just a very shy private person, and didn't enjoy that kind of thing perhaps as well, just on a
because
personal
he
level.
was a social animal. He
Super
was a
social.
very
Yeah.
social person, because with all this outsider thing going on, and I do want to say something about this idea of the outside, but with all this outsider thing going on, he was a charmer. He was a very
Yeah.
seductive man. He had this way to him, like this kind of fragile, big, kind of like not completely well put together bird, lost bird. But then he started talking, and it was so fascinating what he had to say. He
Yeah.
could grab you through food, through
Oh my
smoking,
god.
through walking around in New York with you. He loved going to small restaurants, small unassuming restaurants, and he would take critics to the restaurant where he was well known. He was almost kind of like, someone, Ross Felden, says that at a certain point when he goes to Connecticut to visit him, he goes to the butcher's, and he said, I almost had the feeling that the butcher wasn't going to invite him to cut the meat himself. They were so
Right,
close.
right.
There's such
Yeah.
a symbiotic relationship with the butcher. And he loved talking to all kinds of people. He was interested in people. And, to the point of, like, just a parenthesis about the women, this is the same thing with Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner. I mean, she
Mhm.
was an incredible painter, and no one ever spoke about her. She had no place in society. Alice Neal, who had an amazing exhibition at the Barbican last year, was such an incredible painter. She was, I honestly, that exhibition just shook me
Was she the
so
wife of
much.
someone as well?
No, Alice Neal is very interesting, because, to make a parallel with Philip Guston, she was an incredible activist. She was a communist. She was part of loads of movements, and she painted portraits, figurative work, in a very specific Alice Neal style that's almost undescribable. She paints directly onto the canvas. It's quite impressive. And she's interested in people. So she had a chaotic personal love life. She had a child with a Cuban man who took
Mm.
the daughter after losing a daughter to diphtheria. The father took the child, Isabetta, to Cuba, and she never saw her again. I
Oh,
mean, she did see her
wow.
in her older years, in her adult years, and Isabetta ended up by committing suicide. She was very troubled by the fact that her mother, there was no relationship with her mother. And then Alice Neal had two boys, and they lived in a very peculiar house filled with paintings, not a lot of space for the
Yeah.
boys to develop. And there's an amazing documentary actually about Alice Neal and her life. And she
Wow.
was relentless. She lived from benefits all her life
Wow.
until her last years, where she finally got the
Oh,
appreciation she
gosh.
deserved. And the paintings are absolutely incredible, because she does this beautiful thing, which is to make you look at a person with their own kind of beauty. She ditches conventional beauty, and there's no conventions, and everyone is beautiful.
Yeah.
That's the only way I can describe it. It made me think of a makeup artist who said, because as a makeup artist, biggest joy of my life is that I get to work on everyone's faces, and at a certain point conventional beauty just fades away and I find the beauty in everyone. And that's what
Mm.
Alice Neal did. So in terms of, like, in comparison, you can see that Alice Neal was not a depressive person. She tried to commit suicide when she lost her daughter, but after that she just was a force of nature. She was completely dedicated to her craft. And I think mental health plays such a huge role in
Yeah.
who you are, and who you are as an artist. Van Gogh comes to mind, for example. It doesn't affect the art, but to Hannah Gatsby's point, she talks about that in her stand-up comedy. Maybe Van Gogh would have produced more, been a happier artist, if he had had the help he could have
Yeah.
had, and
Yeah.
Guston, you can see that, the moments where he's doing well, he's painting, and he also has painting as a catalyst to paint, and to paint his troubles.
So after this 1970 show, when he is, just racked with this rejection from the community that he's been a part of in New York, the New York art
Except de
community.
Kooning, we have to say that
Except de
de Kooning
Kooning.
was
Yeah,
supportive.
exactly. Yeah,
The
yeah.
great de
And
Kooning,
and
yeah.
and Guston was like, "What do they think we all are? A baseball team? We're not all doing the same thing." So I kind of like that. But two-thirds of his lifetime output happened in the last 10 years of his life. So between
Oh,
1970 and
okay.
1980. I mean, and he was prolific throughout his life, right? But I heard
Yes.
this in an interview with Musa Mayer, his daughter, and
Okay,
he
that's
he
the half half thing. Okay, that explains it.
he dug deep into that rejection. Like, that was a real propeller for output, and maybe it was just that
Incredible.
turmoil he felt, and the depression he felt, and it all came out. But his late works, as they are described, kind of after the KKK images and the sort of the last shows of his life, are filled with these depressive kind of images. So you would see
Yes.
himself depicted as
Yes.
a cyclops, this really adorable cyclops. I've not seen a cyclops that isn't adorable, but, kind of this image of him, lying on his back with cigarette butts all over and drinks bottles everywhere. And he's in his studio. So there's a lot of, self-reference there. And then he starts using some of his wife's poetry in his work, and in depicting her kind of from the forehead up. There's this sort of half moon image of her forehead and her hair that you see
I have to
throughout a
say,
lot of that work.
men cutting women's bodies really troubles
Mm,
me. I was a bit, I don't know, I was a bit troubled by Musa. I kept thinking of her, and I kept thinking of those paintings with her forehead as a hill, as a sort of a landscapey kind of thing. And
yeah,
also her mind. I think he was worried about her mind. He was worried about her, probably because
she
she also she had a horrible health scare, and
stroke.
he
Yeah, she had a
finally had
stroke.
to, she had a stroke, didn't she? And I read somewhere that he said, well, I went back home, no one was there, had to do my chores, I had to do all the house tasks.
Yeah,
Which, interestingly, is the first thing he mentions. And then he talks about the worry, the horrible worry. I mean, he must have felt completely abandoned.
yeah,
And knowing that he lost his dad and he found his dad by suicide, everything comes back. And I find that so interesting. When you look at a lot of artists, you can see where they go back. Life's a circle, but you do the whole circle, you do the whole journey. So you go back, but you don't end up at the same place. So, of course, cartoons, of course, comics, but you can see his worry with his wife as a parallel with, I'm sure, whatever went on in his life when he was a child in regards to his dad, and also then his mum being a widow. You can kind of see, all that hurt and all that pain.
yeah.
But I wanted to say something about outside, because you're quite right to point that out. He said something after that 70s show, and into that big prolific period of the 10 years of his life. He spoke with Ross Felden, who actually wrote positive reviews about his work, and they became friendly. Ross was a poet, but he also was an art critic, and they became friendly. Felden was much younger, And he says, well, I'm reading Walter Benjamin and I'm really taken by his description of allegory, and I think that's what I'm doing. And of course Felden was like, what? That's so, for lack of a better word, tacky. That doesn't exist in art anymore, because there's symbolism. So symbolism is when an image, something stands for something else, and then allegories is just a system of something that is not in the image, right?
Yeah, allegory.
um
Yeah, allegorical. Yeah.
Allegory, yeah. So so he told Guston, what do you say? I don't think that's what you do. And Guston very stubbornly said, yes, it is. I'm really taken by it. And also, Walter Benjamin talks about the painting as a ruin. And
Hmm.
that is really what takes me, because that's how I
The
see my
painting as
paintings. My
a
paintings are flawed,
the paintings as ruined, you said?
as a ruin.
As a ruin. Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not as ruined, but as flawed. Yes. He says, well, it was forbidden to him to bring anything from the real world to the painting, right? He was creating a fifth dimension with his paintings because it was abstract and it shouldn't reference anything outside. What already, he was called impressionist. So he was already kind of referencing something that
Yeah.
people saw that in him, that he had that need. But then he says, well, I am bringing something that is heterogeneous, let's say, to painting. I'm bringing something of the world into the painting. And the painting is always impure, is always going to have something from the outer world, from out there. And that's really interesting, because not only is he talking about politics, but he's also talking about aesthetics. He's saying, I'm bringing cartoons back, baby. I
Yeah,
am
yeah.
bringing, and I know a lot of artists who are so excited by his work, especially the little paintings, because
Yeah.
I talked about big dimensions, but there's a big wall with smaller, much smaller paintings that are out of this world cute, and at the
Yeah.
same time funny. They are exciting. They are so interesting in their plasticity, because they bring that kind of drawing. For me, as someone who works with drawing, and I work a lot with people who actually work with comics, and who take them to the exhibition space, and to bring that into art, not
Yeah.
like as a sort of a slick way like Liechtenstein did, but like really in the messiness of it, and the small
Mhm.
narratives of Crazy Cat, of those aggressive, violent comics and cartoons. The same story repeats itself over and over again. I think that's what
Yeah.
he's saying as well. There's no purity. We live in a world where there's no hierarchies, and everything we look at feeds our brain, and is imprinted on us, and everything is part of it.
So if we think about, so we might need to wrap up, I think.
I think we need to wrap up.
Yeah.
It's time. It's such a pleasure, but we have to
Yeah.
at some point.
So if you could have an artwork of his that you could live with in your house, which one would you choose?
Oh, I would choose the painter, definitely. So
Oh,
that's the
hmm.
painting you described. Is it the painter or the studio?
I
Or the
think it's the
painter in the
painter.
studio?
I think it's the
The
painter.
painter,
Yeah.
right? Where he paints himself. It was in the Marlborough exhibition, if I'm not mistaken, and it's a painter in front of his a hooded figure. So the painted is a KKK person figure, and painting a self-portrait as a KKK, so as a hooded figure as well. And I thought that was so striking. It is something to denounce violence as if you were external to it. It is something else to say we are somewhat participating in this, whether we are doing it willingly or not. But it goes even deeper than that. And I think I haven't understood yet what he's trying to say. Because as a Jewish person, he could have placed himself as the victim,
Yeah.
and he placed himself as the most horrendous predator you can think of. I'm still thinking about that and what that means. I remember the Dalai Lama, another controversy around the Dalai Lama recently, but he did say some good stuff, and he said, like, we all have Hitler in us. And he also said that when kids are violent, someone asked him once, when my children are violent or aggressive towards each other, what do we do? He said, well, they have to act out that violence, because all of us have that in us.
Mm,
But you, as the grown up, you have to say that that's not good, that you're the one who's setting up the values. So that means we're born with that. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out. And I love that painting because it's huge and it mocks the tradition of painting as well. At the same time, it reveres it. It's very ambivalent. And I love ambivalence. I love complexity. And yeah, I think that's the one.
Nice.
I would have it in a sort of a back room though. I wouldn't want
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
looking at it every day, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe I would. I don't know. Who knows?
It's a big idea to sort of put in the living room, over the fireplace, So I think that mine is the line, which is sort of the main image used for the exhibition. So there's clouds at the top. There is a giant hand exactly coming down, and its two fingers are holding a pencil that is drawing a giant line across sort of a big landscape. And the reason I like it so much is, and I'm gonna tweak your quote a little bit. This is a quote from John Cage that Philip Guston liked a lot, and it was, "When you start working, everybody is in your studio.
Oh, yeah.
The past, your friends, enemies, the art world, and above all, your own ideas, all are there. But as you continue painting, they start leaving one by one, and then you're left completely alone. And then, if you're lucky, even you leave." And,
Amazing.
and
Thank you
Philip,
for correcting that.
yeah, no, that is an idea that is so drawn through his painting. There's so much that is self-referential in the work that he did. I mean, you're not seeing landscapes, you're not seeing vegetation or animal. It's like it all just comes from somewhere deep inside of him. And when when he when I when you see him talking about his own work, particularly in the Michael Blackwood documentary, he talks about all of the destruction. Like, so he ruins a lot of his own paintings. Like, if he doesn't think it feels alive enough, if it doesn't feel like a living thing that is there
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
canvas, then he just gets rid of it. And I found that notion just really, really exciting. And when I look at that painting of the line, I can imagine that is, on his best day in the studio, that's what's happening. Is just
That's what it feels like.
it's what it feels like, is there's a third hand there that is, that you are communing with. And I think I mean, that sort of metaphysical idea is really exciting. And yeah, I think that piece of work really embodies it. And I mean, I think I don't have a wall big enough, of course, so I'd have to buy a different house, but that is the
Yes.
one I'd go for.
Why not?
Exactly.
Well, amazing choice. Yeah, that's a really good choice because I also see it as a sort of the weight of being an artist because as soon as you draw a line, you're marking. And that's it.
Hmm.
It's done, set in stone. I mean, of course not, because as you said, he destroyed a lot of his paintings. But there's something about marking that is so incredible. And I see it also, I'm really preaching to my choir here, but I also see it as a, drawing because it's a stick, it's not a
Yeah,
brush.
exactly.
And that's how he started. And a lot of people say that when he was hiding in his closet, there was this lamp, and that lamp is very often in his paintings.
Yeah, the light bulb,
Um,
the bare light bulb, and that was in his studio as
yes,
well. So yeah,
yeah,
that's a key
yeah,
figure. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, well, this was fun.
Yeah,
Thank you so much,
yeah.
Emily.
Thank you. No, this was great. So that's Philip Guston, and thank you, Joanna. This has been lovely. Thank you, listeners, for listening. And next time we'll see you with another show and another artist.
Take care.
Thank you.